Welcome to the debate. When we gaze upon a map, our eyes are, they're often deceived by the cool geometry of the cartographer. We see lines, clean, static, precise borders drawn by surveyors, long turned to dust. But if you were to stand upon the jagged ridges of the Durand Line today, that porous and frankly perilous frontier between Pakistan and Afghanistan, you would realize very quickly that those lines are not drawn in ink. They are, as the writer Samuel Al-Malik so profoundly observes in his essay Frontiers in Flame, the burnished inscriptions of history itself. They are etched in the ancient rhythms of migration, in the exchange of goods, and recently in the austere alloy of blood and iron.
Right. It is a geography that entirely refuses to be reduced to abstraction. It is a living, breathing, and bleeding entity. And today we turn our gaze to a specific, dangerous moment in that long history, the transition from the cold silence of diplomatic tension to the hot, chaotic theater of open military confrontation. We are dissecting the aftermath of the airstrikes on February 21st, and we are fortunate to have as our guide through this treacherous terrain the essay Frontiers in Flame, History, Sovereignty, and the Burden of Judgment by Sami Ullah Malik.
It is a text of remarkable weight. Sami Ullah Malik frames this current crisis not merely as a border skirmish, but as a fundamental philosophical choice between gunpowder and insight. I stand here today to articulate the perspective of state necessity and security. My contention, aligned with the actions taken by Islamabad, is that the first duty of any government, its primary social contract, is the protection of its citizens. Sovereignty simply cannot be a suicide pact. When a neighbor allows its soil to become a sanctuary for those who slaughter your people, the unfinished chronicle of terrorism must be met with the decisive hand of authority.
And I shall take the side of prudence, historical caution, and humanitarianism. While I acknowledge the profound grievances of the state, I believe Sami Ullah Malik is absolutely correct to warn us that the thunder of artillery is a hazardous script to follow. I will argue that military escalation in this specific region risks repeating the catastrophic failures of the past, specifically the seductive but fatal allure of regime change. I maintain that the fragile authority of treaties, however imperfect they may seem, remains superior to the unpredictable devastation of war.
Well, let us step into the arena then. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must first look at the events of February 21st with clarity. Look, this was not a random exchange of fire in a desolate pass. Pakistan conducted simultaneous targeted operations in Nangarhar, Paktia, and Khost provinces deep inside Afghanistan.
And just to clarify for our audience, because context is everything here, these are not merely names on a map. These provinces are historical hubs of movement, tribal lineage, and commerce. To strike there is to strike at the nervous system of the borderlands.
Precisely. Sami Ullah Malik notes that these strikes were freighted with symbolism. Pakistan targeted 7 specific sites. The intelligence assessment was that these locations served as safe havens for the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, and the Islamic State Khorasan province. The result, according to Islamabad, was the elimination of approximately 80 militants.
80 lives. And therein lies the immediate tragedy.
80 combatants who were actively plotting against the state. This is the crux of my argument. A state cannot remain silent when cross-border aggression bleeds into its cities. We are not discussing theoretical threats or abstract fears here. We are talking about attacks inside Pakistan claimed by groups living openly across the border. Samuel Malik calls this the vocabulary of war, and frankly, Pakistan was forced to speak it because the lexicon of diplomacy had fallen on deaf ears in Kabul. If the Afghan interim government cannot or will not secure the border, the state of Pakistan must. It is a structurally defense of national integrity.
I see the architecture of your argument, and it is formidable in its logic. However, I must draw your attention to the other side of that coin, which Sami Ullah Malik outlines with such melancholy precision. Sovereignty, the principle that a nation's borders are inviolable, occupies a sacrosanct status in international law for a reason. Its breach is seldom regarded as anything less than an act of aggression. Kabul has condemned these strikes not as justice, but as a violation of their territory and a humanitarian tragedy. They allege civilian casualties, women and children caught in the blast radius of that structural defense you just mentioned.
Casualties are the tragic arithmetic of conflict, unfortunately. But we must distinguish between the deliberate targeting of innocents and the collateral tragedy of war. The intent matters.
Does it? I mean, to the mother bearing a child in Paktia, the intent blurs entirely when the result is death. You speak of enforcing security, but my concern, and indeed the concern raised by Samiullah Malik, is the efficacy of the method. History instructs us that bombing territory rarely clarifies intent. It usually serves only to incubate the next generation of grievance. By choosing the remedy of gunpowder, are we truly solving the deficit of trust, or are we merely digging the chasm deeper?
That question brings us directly to the legal and political mechanism that is currently crumbling before our eyes, the Doha Agreement. We need to unpack this because it is the framework upon which this entire dispute hangs.
Yes, let us strip away the jargon. For the benefit of those who may not follow the minutiae of diplomatic accords, the Doha Agreement was the deal signed in 2020 between the United States and the Taliban. It was the document that paved the way for the American withdrawal.
Correct. And the central pillar of that agreement, the sine qua non for the region, was a solemn guarantee from the Taliban. They promised, in writing, that Afghan soil would never again be used by terrorist groups to threaten other countries. Pakistan contends that this agreement has been violated not just in spirit, but in flagrant fact. The TTP is operating out of Afghanistan. They are organizing, training, and launching attacks from there. That is a fundamental breach of the covenant.
TTP through the same lens as Islamabad or Washington. They do not. They do not view the TTP as international terrorists in the mold of al-Qaeda. They view them as brothers, or as an internal Pakistani issue, a cousin movement with whom they share ideological DNA.
Which is a convenient evasion of responsibility. It is this exact evasion that prompted President Asif Ali Zardari to issue a warning that Malik describes as chilling in its clarity. Zardari stated that the presence of these militant sanctuaries in Afghanistan risks propelling the world towards a catastrophe reminiscent of September 11, 2001. That is not a casual historical reference.
It is a potent invocation of memory, certainly. Invoking 9/11 is the ultimate rhetorical alarm bell. It summons the ghosts of global conflict.
It is also a necessary reality check. Samiullah Malik identifies this as a reminder that these crises might appear regional, but they possess global tentacles. If the Taliban cannot or will not control the TTP and ISKP, the shadow of threat stretches toward Western capitals just as surely as it does toward Islamabad. We are witnessing the crumbling of the region's security architecture. If the documentary evidence Pakistan has provided, dossiers of camp locations, names, communications, is ignored by Kabul, what option remains but force?
But look at the risk of that rhetoric. Samiullah Malik writes that interpretation withers in suspicion. By framing this entire conflict through the lens of the war on terror, by invoking the specter of 9/11, we risk missing the local reality. The TTP is not al-Qaeda. They have local roots, local grievances, and local dynamics. You cannot bomb the Taliban into accepting Pakistan's definition of the TTP. Malik has this beautiful, haunting line: interpretation thrives in the climate of trust. Right now, there is zero trust. This is the fog of accusation. When you treat a neighbor solely as a security threat, you ensure they become one.
I must push back on that characterization. It is not Pakistan treating the neighbor as a threat. It is the threat emanating from the neighbor that dictates the posture. You cannot build trust while someone is shooting at you from across the fence. But let us pivot. The essay by Samiullah Malik does not remain confined to the war room or the situation room. He moves the lens to the marketplace. We need to discuss the economic and humanitarian theater of this conflict.
Yes, let us look at the slow violences. This is perhaps where Samiullah Malik's prose is most affecting. We focus on airstrikes because they are loud, sudden, and cinematic, but he speaks of the paralysis of trade. When these tensions flare, the border crossings close. Torkham, Chaman, these are not just checkpoints, they are lifelines.
It is a heavy price, I concede. These closures cost millions of dollars a day in lost revenue for both nations.
It is not just dollars, it is survival. It is bread, not bullets, that first bears the injury. Afghanistan is a landlocked nation. It relies on Pakistan for food, for medicine, for construction materials. When you shut that border to punish the regime or secure the line, you are effectively strangling the population. Malik notes that unemployment becomes the nursery of radicalization. By prioritizing a military solution, you're incubating the very economic crisis that breeds extremism. You're creating a vicious cycle where insecurity feeds destitution, and destitution feeds insecurity. Can the state afford to starve the region in order to secure it?
Requisite for commerce, not its enemy. You cannot have a bustling marketplace in a zone of terror. You cannot drive a truck full of pomegranates through a checkpoint if that checkpoint is being shelled by mortars. Pakistan cannot be, to use Sami Ullah Malik's evocative phrase, the wall upon which the first blow falls indefinitely. We are speaking of a structural assurance of safety. The vicious cycle you describe is driven by the lawlessness that allows militants to thrive. Only by reestablishing the state's authority over violence can we create the stability necessary for trade to resume.
But at what point does the wall crumble from the very measures taken to defend it? The suspension of cross-border trade, once measured in billions, is bleeding both nations dry. The essay asks a poignant question. How long can either state sustain such a burden? You are killing the patient to cure the disease.
Sometimes the chemotherapy is harsh, but the cancer is fatal. This leads us to the darker potential outcomes discussed in the source material. We must address the peril of regime change versus the utility of back-channel diplomacy. Defense Minister Khawaja Mohammad Asif made some remarks regarding alternative possibilities if Kabul fails its obligations.
That is a chilling phrase, alternative possibilities. It is diplomatic code, thinly veiled for toppling a government.
It is the language of statescraft. Statesmanship sometimes requires the stern discipline of threats to force compliance. If the documentary evidence is ignored, as Islamabad contends, the state must signal that its patience is not infinite. You must place all options on the table to compel the other side to blink.
And here I must voice the strongest possible objection, echoing the wisdom found in Frontiers in Flame. The doctrine of regime change appears deceptively tidy upon paper. We look at a map and think, if we just replace the men at the top, the problem is solved. But look at the history. Look at Iraq. Look at Libya. Sami Ullah Malik reminds us that externally induced transformations rarely yield durable stability.
But is the current stability durable? It seems non-existent.
The architecture of imposed order collapses the moment the architects leave. We know this. We have lived this. To entertain the notion of destabilizing the Kabul government is to invite chaos. You might remove the current leadership, but what fills the vacuum? Likely something far worse, or total anarchy that spills over every border.
So what is the alternative? Do we just accept a hostile entity on our flank? Do we accept that our neighbor is a permanent launching pad for attacks?
No, the alternative is the subtler arts of back-channel diplomacy. The quiet word exchanged in confidence has historically been more effective than the thunder of artillery. There are moderate currents within the Taliban, elements that want trade, that want international recognition, that understand the need for good relations. We need to be strengthening those currents, not uniting the whole movement against an external aggressor. When you attack openly, they rally around the flag. You lose the nuance.
But while we wait for that quiet word to take effect, and that could take years, the wider geometry of the region is shifting. This brings us to the geopolitical chessboard. This isn't just about Pakistan and Afghanistan. Islamabad contends that India, and potentially Israel, are providing support to anti-Pakistan elements from Afghan soil.
The specter of the foreign hand. It is a classic narrative in South Asian politics, often used to deflect internal criticism.
It is not a specter if the evidence exists. Samia Ullah Malik notes that in a region shadowed by nuclear capability, the perils are self-evident. Pakistan feels encircled. You have a hostile eastern border with India. Now you have a hostile western border. If external intelligence agencies are funding the TTP to bleed Pakistan, which is a standard proxy warfare tactic, then Pakistan is not just fighting a ragtag militant group, it is managing a frontline position in a wider strategic encirclement. That changes the calculus completely. It transforms a border dispute into a fight for survival.
I find that focusing on external blame often serves as a distraction. It is a way to externalize internal failures of policy. Samiullah Malik points out that neighbors like China, Iran, and Uzbekistan are uneasy, yes, but their interest lies in stability, not in a widening road of confrontation. China wants the Belt and Road Initiative to work. They need safe roads, not war zones. Iran has its own issues. Paranoia regarding external actors complicates the intricate regional chessboard. It prevents the necessary thawing of the frost of mistrust.
It is not paranoia if the threat is existential. If your neighbor is inviting your enemies to dinner, you do not simply send a polite note asking them to keep the noise down.
But does expanding the circle of accusation help secure the border, or does it merely ensure that the embers now glowing cast a glare across the whole of South and Central Asia? If you drag India and Israel into the narrative, you are internationalizing a border dispute. That raises the stakes to a dangerous level, where miscalculation becomes catastrophic.
Before we conclude our analysis of these grim scenarios, I think it is vital we pause. We are navigating deep waters today, and our charts have been provided by the incisive mind of Samiullah Malik.
Indeed, it is worth reflecting on the intellectual weight of this essay. Samiullah Malik does not merely report on airstrikes or trade figures, he elevates the discussion to the level of political philosophy. He forces us to look at this news event not as a fleeting headline, but as a meditation on history's tribunal.
He reminds us that the text demands we look beyond the fog of accusation. The value of Frontiers in Flame lies in its refusal to offer simple answers. It doesn't say Pakistan is right or Afghanistan is right in a simplistic binary. It demands that we weigh the iron of security against the blood of consequence.
Precisely. It is a reminder that while the war has begun, as Malik writes, its ending is not yet inscribed. We are in the middle of the story, and the choices made today determine the ending.
Let us then move to our closing arguments. Based on the evidence and the philosophy laid out by Samiullah Malik, my position remains clear. Pakistan seeks responsibility, not dominion. The state implies that it has the capacity to marry strength with wisdom. But let us be under no illusion. Strength must come first. You cannot negotiate from a position of vulnerability. If you signal weakness in this region, you are devoured. National survival is non-negotiable. If the fire is to be extinguished, it sometimes requires a controlled burn, a military intervention to prevent the whole forest from being consumed.
And I remain unconvinced that fire can ever truly be controlled in such a volatile geography. As Samiullah Malik concludes, history is an exacting tribunal. It judges not who fired first, but who had the wisdom to know when to cease. The embers now glowing could indeed cast a glare across the entire region if the gun is chosen over judgment. The choice is between the widening road of confrontation or the harder, nobler highway of prudence. We need to fix the economy, open the trade routes, and talk to the moderates. That is the only way out.
We both agree, however, on the central question posed by the writer. Can these two states transcend the reflexive force?
That is the burden of judgment. The rifle may clear a path, as Malik says, but it cannot reveal the destination.
The war has begun. The ending awaits its inscription.
Indeed. Thank you for listening to this deliberation on Frontiers in Flame by Samiullah Malik.
Thank you for joining us in the debate.